It's mind-boggling to know that they know where you're going, but they won't tell you. So I was shuffled from Massachusetts quickly to New Hampshire, from New Hampshire to Vermont, Vermont to Philadelphia, Philadelphia to Texas. When I got to Texas, I asked the ICE agent, because it said Mexico, and I said, can you please, please, please have a little bit of empathy for me and tell me if you're taking me across the border? And he said, no, we're taking you to the final destination, your final stop before your deportation, which is South Louisiana. Hardly anyone ever gets out of there. So I just mustered up the courage to cry and sleep throughout that final voyage. And when I got to South Louisiana, I was finally able to, by the grace of God, some girl let me use her minutes to make a phone call and then to tell my family where I was and the attorneys.
And so that's, Todd, when you are able to help to get her.
You hear that testimony, and you understand immediately that what we are witnessing is not an isolated administrative hiccup or bureaucratic confusion, but the deliberate architecture of cruelty dressed up in the procedural language of enforcement. And before we even begin to unpack the staggering moral bankruptcy on display here, let me tell you exactly what is about to unfold, because this story gets worse with every single detail, and I mean exponentially worse in ways that should make every person who believes in human dignity physically ill. This mother describes being shuffled like cargo through a Byzantine network of detention facilities, spanning Massachusetts to New Hampshire to Vermont to Philadelphia to Texas, and finally to South Louisiana, a journey orchestrated with such calculated opacity that even ICE agents themselves acknowledged this facility as a final destination where hardly anyone ever gets out, and when she begs for basic human empathy, pleading to know whether they're deporting her across the border, the response she receives is clinical detachment wrapped in bureaucratic menace. Close to 98% of people in Louisiana detention are in for-profit prisons run by Geo Group and LaSalle Corrections, which means taxpayer dollars are flowing directly into the coffers of corporate entities whose entire business model depends on human beings remaining incarcerated. And here's where this story takes a turn that should dominate every news cycle for months, because the child of this detained mother has an aunt who serves as White House press secretary, creating a situation so grotesquely ironic that it reads like political satire, except people's lives are being destroyed in real time. Now stay with me, because the contradictions are about to pile up like a philosophical indictment of everything this administration claimed to represent when it campaigned on restoring dignity and humanity to immigration policy. ICE deported more than 271,000 unauthorized immigrants in fiscal year 2024, the highest tally recorded by the agency since fiscal year 2014, when the Obama administration carried out 316,000 deportations, which means that despite all the progressive rhetoric about being different from Trump, about restoring compassion to the system, the number of removals conducted in 2024 by ICE has surpassed those conducted during the first Trump administration. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because we're talking about a Democratic administration that explicitly promised to reverse the cruelty of its predecessor, but instead institutionalized and expanded the very enforcement apparatus it once condemned. The Biden administration didn't just continue Trump's deportation machine, they supercharged it, they made it more efficient, they streamlined the process. President Biden directed ICE to issue requests for information and contract solicitations to identify new detention facilities to allow for a possible expansion of immigration detention across the country, even as he was heading toward the end of his term, literally building the infrastructure that Trump could weaponize even further. And here's where the for-profit dimension becomes absolutely nauseating in its implications, because we're not talking about publicly administered facilities with democratic oversight and accountability. We're talking about corporations extracting profit from human misery. Congress approved $3.4 billion in taxpayer dollars for fiscal year 2024 for ICE to detain an average daily population of 41,500 people, and that money flows to private companies like Geo Group, whose executives are getting wealthy while people languish in conditions that detainees have decried as abusive treatment, including racist treatment by guards, poor food, and unsanitary conditions. The South Louisiana ICE Processing Center in Basile, that final destination referenced in this mother's testimony, is now used exclusively to house male and female ICE detainees awaiting immigration court hearings and deportation, after Geo Group reactivated the facility in 2019, transforming what had been an idle state prison into a federal immigration detention cash cow, and the human rights documentation from Louisiana facilities reads like something from a completely different era of American governance. Our human rights report, Inside the Black Hole, compiles information from 2 years of visits to 9 immigration jails in Louisiana, including 6,384 interviews and 7 jail tours, with first-hand testimonies presenting damning evidence of intentional abuse. And when you read accounts of 5-point shackles fastened over open wounds and torturous solitary confinement that lasts for months, you begin to understand that this is not detention as bureaucratic necessity, but detention as punishment, detention as deterrence, detention as state-sponsored trauma. But wait, because the hypocrisy crystallizes even further when you examine exactly who this administration chose to label as threats deserving this treatment. And here the attorney in this case reveals something that should spark criminal investigations, because ICE officers allegedly joked that this mother was just more business for the for-profit prison system, reducing a human being to a revenue stream in casual conversation. And then the Biden administration knowingly lied by branding her a criminal illegal alien, even after its own lawyer admitted in court that characterization was factually and legally false. Let that sink in for a moment, because we're talking about deliberate misrepresentation by federal agents operating under an administration that promised transparency and adherence to the rule of law, and this pattern of dehumanization through false criminalization serves a very specific ideological function, which is to manufacture public consent for cruelty by suggesting that anyone caught in this enforcement dragnet must have done something to deserve it. A report by Physicians for Human Rights and researchers from Harvard Law School and Medical School found that ICE was failing to follow its own policies, and that the use of solitary had increased under the Biden administration, which means even the minimal standards that supposedly govern these facilities are routinely violated. And a group of Democrats in Congress wrote to then Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, calling for an end to the misuse of solitary in detention centers, but those pleas went largely unheeded because the political calculus demanded looking tough on immigration. Now let's talk about Louisiana specifically, because the largest populations of immigrant detainees are in Texas and Louisiana, and Louisiana in particular has become a key player in the system, which is not accidental, but represents a deliberate strategy of locating detention infrastructure in states where political opposition will be minimal, and where poverty creates economic incentives for communities to accept these facilities. The state used to have one of the nation's highest numbers of incarcerated people, but after criminal justice reforms in 2017, the general prison population decline, which created excess capacity that private prison corporations immediately repurposed for immigration detention, turning criminal justice reform into a pipeline for immigration incarceration. This is the perverse logic of mass incarceration in America, where reducing one form of caging simply creates infrastructure for another, and the people making money off this system have every incentive to ensure the detention population remains high, because the Basel Detention Center had, as of 2024, a guaranteed minimum population of 700 brer, meaning the government is contractually obligated to keep beds filled or pay for empty ones, creating a financial imperative to detain people regardless of necessity or proportionality. And this is happening while Biden faced withering criticism from all sides because immigration emerged as his administration's greatest political vulnerability, with polls showing immigration as a weak spot for Biden, with just an 18% approval rating on the issue, which pushed him to adopt increasingly punitive measures in a desperate attempt to neutralize Republican attacks. And he faced significant criticism from progressives in his base, who feel he has eroded the asylum system and has not done enough to protect immigrants, with immigration emerging as a political vulnerability, forcing him to endorse tough immigration reform legislation and implement controversial border policies that candidate Biden in 2020 would have rejected. This is the tragedy of Democratic triangulation on immigration, where the party abandons its stated principles in pursuit of electoral advantage that never materializes because Republicans will always outflank them on xenophobia, always move the goalposts further right, always demand more cruelty as the price of political respectability, and Democrats respond not by defending the humanity of migrants, but by trying to prove they can be just as tough, just as willing to cage people, just as committed to enforcement theater. The American Civil Liberties Union said it intends to challenge Biden's executive order in court, with League Alert stating, "It was illegal when Trump did it, and it is no less illegal now," which perfectly encapsulates the legal and moral continuity between these administrations despite their supposed ideological differences. Amy Fisher, Director of Refugee and Migrant Rights at Amnesty International USA, said Biden's actions set a dangerous international precedent, and expressed deep disappointment, seeing him so hell-bent on dismantling human rights for people seeking asylum. These are not partisan progressive advocates, exaggerating for effect, but mainstream human rights organizations documenting systematic violations of international law, and their warnings were vindicated by the empirical record, because while the administration was estimated to have naturalized nearly 3.5 million people and extended temporary protected status to 1.7 million potential new beneficiaries, those accomplishments were completely overshadowed by historic highs of nearly 2.5 million encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border in fiscal year 2023, with a monthly high of nearly 302,000 encounters in December 2023, creating a political disaster that Democrats proved utterly incapable of narratively managing. The woman in this testimony describes that journey through the detention archipelago with devastating specificity, being denied the most basic information about her own fate, shuffled through jurisdictions without explanation or recourse. And here's what makes this even more unconscionable. Detainees at HELLHOLE in Louisiana had the lowest rates of representation in the country, with only 6% of immigrants detained there, represented by counsel in 2015, and only 5% of all asylum applications granted compared to 37% and 48% nationally. This is not accidental geography but strategic placement, locating detention facilities in remote areas far from legal resources and immigrant communities, making effective legal representation nearly impossible, and ensuring that people will be deported not because they lack valid claims, but because they lack access to justice. SPLC requested a preliminary injunction to increase attorneys' access, noting that the facility had only one attorney visitation room and required phone calls to be scheduled a week in advance with a 20-minute limit, which are conditions designed to thwart legal representation while maintaining plausible deniability about constitutional access. And the medical neglect documented in Louisiana detention centers rises to the level of deliberate indifference because we have allegations that officials subjected detainees to medical neglect, physical abuse, and solitary confinement, with one detainee's brother claiming to have listened in on a phone call where an official beat and choked him after he asked for pain medication. And that detainee submitted at least 29 grievances alleging he was refused medical care before dying in custody. These are not isolated incidents, but systematic patterns indicating that the cruelty is not a bug but a feature, not an unfortunate byproduct of underfunding, but a deliberate strategy of using harsh detention conditions as deterrence, betting that if you make the experience punitive enough, people will stop coming, which is both morally bankrupt and empirically ineffective, because people fleeing violence and poverty don't stop seeking safety just because the destination is cruel. What this mother experienced was the deliberate orchestration of psychological torture through uncertainty and powerlessness, being moved across vast distances without explanation or appeal, and when she finally reaches someone with phone minutes to contact her family and attorneys, that communication happens not because the system facilitated it, but because another detained person showed solidarity and shared their limited resources. This is the banality of evil operating through bureaucratic procedures, where no single person feels responsible for the totality of the cruelty, because everyone is just following protocols, just transferring a detainee, just processing paperwork, and the cumulative effect is the systematic destruction of human dignity, in service of enforcement metrics and corporate profit. 200 NGOs delivered a letter to the White House expressing outrage over the administration's expansion of the cruel and unnecessary immigration detention system, noting that Biden signed a spending bill, providing $3.4 billion in taxpayers' money for ICE detention, and these organizations pointed out that on the date of Biden's inauguration, fewer than 15,000 people were in ICE detention, presenting a remarkable opportunity to wind down a wasteful and abusive system. But instead of seizing that opportunity to fundamentally transform immigration enforcement, the administration chose to rebuild and expand the machinery of detention. They noted that the system Biden was expanding is riddled with abuse and impunity, with senior officials aware of these significant human rights concerns since day one. This wasn't ignorance or bureaucratic inertia, but a deliberate political choice to prioritize the appearance of border security over the reality of human rights. And that choice was made with full knowledge of the consequences, because the advocacy community, legal organizations, and even congressional Democrats repeatedly warned that these policies were not just ineffective, but actively harmful. The fact that this is happening to someone connected however distantly to the White House press secretary makes visible what happens to thousands of people with no political connections and no platform to tell their stories. And while I don't want to center this woman's family relationship over her own experience, the symbolism is too powerful to ignore because it demonstrates that even proximity to power offers no protection from a system designed to grind people up, and it exposes the fundamental hollowness of the administration's claims about humane immigration enforcement when someone with family ties to the administration's public face can be disappeared into the for-profit detention network and branded a criminal despite contradictory evidence from the government's own lawyers. If this can happen to her, Imagine what happens to people without any connections, without any advocates, without anyone who even knows where they've been taken, and multiply this story by hundreds of thousands, because that's the scale of suffering we're discussing. Immigration detention has become another system of mass incarceration for Black and brown people in the United States, which connects immigration enforcement to the broader architecture of racial capitalism, where the caging of marginalized populations generates profit for corporations and political capital for aspiring authoritarians. And this is not some unfortunate parallel, but the same system operating in different registers, because private prison companies don't care whether they're incarcerating people for criminal convictions or immigration violations, as long as the beds stay filled and the contracts keep flowing. The logic is identical. Take vulnerable populations, strip them of legal protections, subject them to conditions that would be illegal in any other context, and extract maximum value from their powerlessness while selling it to the public as necessary security measures. This is your tax dollars at work, funding a system that takes mothers away from their children and shuttles them across the country in secret, that partners with for-profit corporations whose incentives are perfectly aligned against human freedom, that lies about who these people are to justify the cruelty, and that operates with such impunity that ICE agents openly joke about detainees as revenue streams. During the Biden administration, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security renewed dozens of contracts and entered into new agreements with private prison companies, including opening the Moshannon Valley Detention Center in Pennsylvania, one of ICE's 12 facilities that hold over 1,000 people each, which represents not winding down Trump's infrastructure but expanding it, building new capacity for future administrations to fill with even more detained people. And we need to be absolutely clear about what this represents politically, because this is what happens when Democrats abandon any pretense of offering a genuine alternative to Republican xenophobia and instead compete on who can be more punitive, more enforcement-focused, more willing to sacrifice the vulnerable on the altar of political triangulation. The administration believed or claimed to believe that if they just deported enough people, detained enough families, expanded enough facilities, they could neutralize immigration as a political issue and win over moderate voters. But that strategy failed catastrophically because Trump repeated his 2016 messages going further than he did 8 years ago, accused of echoing Hitler and saying immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country, and voters didn't reward Democrats for their enforcement theater, but instead chose the authentic xenophobe over the pale imitation. This mother's testimony is not an aberration, but a representation, not an outlier, but the norm, not a mistake, but the system working exactly as designed to terrorize people into not exercising their legal right to seek asylum, to make the process so punishing that death or persecution in their home countries seems preferable to the cruelty awaiting them in American detention. And every single person involved in building and maintaining this system, from the ICE agents making jokes about more business, to the corporate executives counting their profits, to the politicians approving the funding, to the administrators expanding the facilities, all of them bear responsibility for this ongoing atrocity that we're funding with our tax dollars and conducting in our names. The call to action here is not complicated. This system needs to be dismantled, not reformed, abolished, not improved, because you cannot humanize an infrastructure designed to dehumanize. You cannot make kind a system whose entire purpose is cruelty, and you cannot achieve justice through the mechanisms of injustice, no matter how much you rebrand them or who is administering them.